In the thick tropical vegetation surrounding Taivu Point on Guadalcanal, the date was August 19, 1942, and Second Lieutenant Genjiro Imai sat recording his observations in a personal journal. He belonged to the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company, and what he wrote down captured something profound happening among the Japanese soldiers landing on this god-forsaken island. Through the suffocating canopy of palms and creeping vines that seemed to strangle everything they touched, Imai and 916 other troops from Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's force had just come ashore from destroyer transports in a nighttime operation that Tokyo believed would be the opening move in retaking the airfield the Americans called Henderson. Intelligence briefings had told them to expect maybe 2,000 American troops, poorly trained men who would panic easily, soft from comfortable lives back home. Ichiki himself had waved off suggestions that he wait for additional forces, telling his officers with absolute certainty that these Americans would be driven into the ocean before the sun came up again. None of these combat veterans, hardened by years fighting across China and throughout Southeast Asia, had any conception of what awaited them. They were about to face something completely outside the experience of the Imperial Japanese Army. This wasn't going to be merely a defeat, which by itself was almost inconceivable for soldiers who had known nothing except victory since 1937. What approached was a complete dismantling of every tactical belief, every strategic assumption, every ideological certainty that formed the foundation of how Japanese forces understood warfare. The jungle itself would turn against them. The darkness that had belonged to Japanese soldiers since the war began would become their enemy. The sheer magnitude of American firepower, the precision of their coordination, the overwhelming destructive capacity would demolish any notion that Japanese forces held superiority in close quarters fighting. The transformation had started 2 weeks earlier when 11,000 United States Marines from the 1st Marine Division hit the beaches at Lunga Point on the 7th of August. General Alexander Vandergrift's Leathernecks were executing what they called Operation Watchtower, marking the first time American forces had gone on the offensive anywhere in the Pacific. The mission looked straightforward enough on paper. Grab the Japanese airfield that was almost finished, set up defensive positions around it, hold that ground until someone came to relieve them. The reality turned out to be the longest and most brutal campaign Marines had fought up to that point in their history, waged in an environment that tested human endurance past any reasonable limit. Guadalcanal itself stretched 90 miles from end to end and 25 miles across at its widest point, with mountains rising 8,000 feet into clouds that never seemed to clear in the interior. Where Henderson Field sat on the coastal plain, the terrain was kunai grass mixed with swamp and jungle, so dense you couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The heat crushed you, with humidity that never dropped below 90%. Mosquitoes came in swarms thick enough that men breathed them in. The streams and rivers that looked so clean and inviting in aerial photographs were crawling with parasites and disease. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, tropical ulcers, all of these would eventually put more men out of action than enemy bullets ever did. That first morning, though, the Marines discovered the airfield practically abandoned. 2,200 Japanese construction workers and 600 naval troops had fled into the jungle when the Americans landed, leaving behind equipment, supplies, and most importantly, the airfield itself. By the time the sun went down on August 8th, American engineers were already working to finish the runway. They named it after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine pilot who had died at Midway. Within days, the first planes were landing, and the island became home to what everyone would remember as the Cactus Air Force. The Japanese response came fast and hit the American Navy like a sledgehammer. On the night of August 9th, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa brought 7 cruisers and a destroyer through the darkness in a surprise attack that became known as the Battle of Savo Island, the worst defeat the United States Navy had ever suffered. 4 heavy cruisers went to the bottom in less than an hour: the Quincy, Vincennes, Astoria, and the Australian ship Canberra. More than 1,000 sailors burned to death in the water. The surviving Allied ships withdrew, taking most of the supplies that hadn't been unloaded yet. The Marines found themselves stranded on that island, cut off from support, facing Japanese forces with barely half their equipment and rations. What the Japanese High Command failed to understand in those early August days was how Henderson Field had become the key to everything happening around Guadalcanal. Whoever controlled that airfield controlled the surrounding waters during daylight. Aircraft flying from Henderson could hit any Japanese ship within 200 miles. This single fact dictated how the entire campaign would unfold. The Japanese could own the night, running troops and supplies in on fast destroyers in what became known as the Tokyo Express. But when the sun came up, American aircraft ruled the sky. The strategic situation demanded that Japan retake Henderson immediately, before the Americans could dig in properly. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army, based at Rabaul, got the assignment. Hyakutake didn't have many forces available right away. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade was at Palau. The 4th Infantry Regiment was in the Philippines. The closest unit available was Colonel Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, which had been stationed near Guam for the Midway operation that got cancelled after the naval disaster in June. Colonel Ichiki had a reputation as a top-notch tactician from his time as an infantry school instructor. He also had a reputation for being impulsive and having absolute faith that Japanese fighting spirit would overcome any American material advantage. Before leaving Truk for Guadalcanal, Ichiki received explicit orders to wait for the rest of his regiment before trying to retake the airfield. But Ichiki had no respect for American fighting ability. He had studied reports from everywhere Japanese forces had encountered Western troops, in China, the Philippines, all over. They lacked discipline. They broke under pressure. They couldn't match Japanese warriors when it came to close combat. On the night of August 18th, 6 destroyers delivered 917 men from Ichiki's advance element to Taivu Point, about 15 miles east of where the Americans had set up their perimeter. The landing went smoothly without the Americans detecting anything. Ichiki immediately sent reconnaissance patrols out to assess enemy strength and find weak points in their defences. It was a standard tactical move that would prove catastrophic. On August 19th, a patrol from Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, under Captain Charles Brush, was moving along the coastal track toward Coley Point when they ran into Japanese soldiers. The two forces collided in a short, vicious firefight. The Marines killed 31 Japanese soldiers and grabbed documents that revealed a significant enemy force operating in the area. More importantly, the captured papers showed the Japanese had completely underestimated how many Americans were actually there. Captain Brush raced back to the perimeter with his intelligence haul. General Vandergrift immediately grasped what was coming. A Japanese attack soon, probably from the east. He ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to strengthen defences along the sandbar, where what the Marines called the Tenaru River met the ocean. The actual name was the Ilu River, but the Marines got it wrong and the mistake stuck in all the history books. Cates deployed Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines along the riverbank, with machine guns positioned to create overlapping fields of fire across the sandbar. What happened next became one of the most lopsided battles in Marine Corps history. Colonel Ichiki, instead of waiting for intelligence from his missing patrol or for reinforcements, decided to attack immediately. On the night of August 20th into the early morning of August 21st, he ordered a frontal assault straight across the sandbar. Japanese doctrine emphasized that spiritual power and aggressive night attacks would overcome enemy firepower. Ichiki believed his veterans could smash through American defenses through pure audacity and close-quarters fighting where Japanese soldiers excelled with bayonets and grenades. Just after midnight, a Solomon Islands scout named Jacob Vuza, who had escaped Japanese captors after hours of torture, stumbled into the Marine lines with a warning. The Japanese were coming. Minutes later, the attack began. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged across the sandbar, screaming battle cries, firing rifles, throwing grenades. They ran straight into a killing zone the Marines had prepared with methodical care. The Browning water-cooled machine guns opened up. These weapons, perfected during the First World War, were the unsung heroes of Marine firepower. Each gun could maintain 600 rounds per minute indefinitely, as long as you kept the water jacket filled. The Marines had positioned them so that no part of the sandbar remained uncovered. Japanese soldiers fell in waves as the heavy .30 caliber rounds tore through them. The ones who made it across the sandbar ran into 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister rounds, essentially giant shotgun shells that shredded human bodies. The attack continued for hours. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers charged into the machine gun fire. Some reached the Marine positions and fought hand-to-hand. Marines used rifles, knives, fists, whatever they could grab. But the defensive preparations held. The overlapping fields of fire prevented any breakthrough. As dawn approached, Ichiki's attack had completely stalled. More than 800 of his men lay dead or dying on the sandbar and in the shallow water. Daybreak brought no relief for the surviving Japanese. Vandergrift ordered a counterattack using elements of 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. 5 Stuart light tanks crossed the sandbar and began systematically hunting down Japanese soldiers who had taken cover in the coconut groves. War correspondent Richard Tregaskis, watching from a Marine position, described the scene as tanks bustling among the trees, pivoting, turning, spitting sheets of yellow flame, flushing out group after group of Japanese who were shot down by canister shells. By midday on August 21st, the Battle of the Tenaru was over. Of 917 Japanese soldiers who had landed at Taivu Point, approximately 800 were dead. About 128 survivors, mostly from support units that had stayed near the landing site, melted into the jungle. They would send a radio message back to 17th Army headquarters reporting the disaster. Among the dead was Colonel Ichiki himself, though accounts differ on exactly how he died. The official Japanese version claimed he burned his regimental colours and committed ritual suicide. Some witnesses said he died leading a final charge. Marine casualties were about 40 killed and wounded. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese soldiers was devastating. Captured documents and accounts after the war revealed the shock of learning an entire regiment had been annihilated in a single night. The Americans hadn't fought the way Japanese doctrine predicted. They didn't panic under night attack. They didn't break when charged by screaming warriors. Instead, they had waited in prepared positions, let the Japanese enter killing zones, then systematically destroyed them with concentrated firepower. The most devastating revelation came from examining captured equipment and assessing the battlefield. The Americans possessed a level of material wealth that Japanese intelligence had completely failed to grasp. The Browning machine guns never jammed, never overheated beyond their design capacity, never failed from poor maintenance or inadequate spare parts. Every Marine seemed to carry more ammunition than an entire Japanese squad. The artillery support Marines could call upon exceeded anything the Japanese could deploy. The coordination between infantry, artillery, and even naval gunfire from ships offshore represented an integrated system of destruction that Japanese forces had never encountered. Within days, more Japanese forces were already heading toward Guadalcanal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto organized a massive naval operation to support the next attempt at retaking Henderson Field. 3 slow transport ships left Truk on August 16th, carrying the remaining 1,400 soldiers from Ichiki's regiment, plus 500 naval marines. After a naval battle called the Eastern Solomons resulted in heavy damage to one transport, Japanese command decided to abandon slow transport ships entirely. Instead, they would use destroyers for what became the Tokyo Express runs. Between August 29th and September 4th, various destroyers and light cruisers delivered almost 5,000 troops from General Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade to Taivu Point. The Tokyo Express worked brilliantly for moving men. Destroyers could make the round trip from the Shortland Islands to Guadalcanal in a single night, minimizing exposure to American air attack. But the method had a critical weakness. Heavy equipment couldn't be transported this way. Artillery pieces, tanks, trucks and most importantly adequate food and ammunition, had to be left behind. This logistical reality would ultimately doom every Japanese offensive on Guadalcanal. Soldiers arrived with only what they could carry. They depended on local foraging and whatever supplies could be infiltrated through American lines. As the campaign wore on, Japanese troops found themselves fighting not just American firepower, but starvation itself. General Kawaguchi set September 12th as the date for his assault on Henderson Field. His plan involved a three-pronged attack. One force would strike from the west along the coast. A second force would attack from the south, penetrating through dense jungle to hit what Japanese intelligence believed was the weakest point in American defenses. Kawaguchi himself would lead the main effort from the south, approaching along an inland ridge that overlooked Henderson Field. What Kawaguchi didn't know was that Marine intelligence had already identified this ridge as the most likely approach route. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding the 1st Raider Battalion, conducted a raid on Tasimboko village on September 8th and discovered massive supply dumps, indicating a large Japanese force was concentrating nearby. Edson immediately understood the Japanese plan. They would come from the south, using the ridge as their approach. Edson requested permission to establish a defensive line on the ridge itself. Vandegrift approved. On September 10th and 11th, Edson positioned approximately 840 Marines from his raiders and the 1st Parachute Battalion along the ridge. He selected defensive positions with the same methodical care that had characterized the Tanaru defenses. Machine guns positioned to create interlocking fire. Mortar crews registered on likely approach routes. Artillery from the 11th Marines plotted defensive fire missions. Every advantage of terrain and firepower was calculated and prepared. The ridge itself was a narrow coral spine about 1,000 meters long, consisting of 3 distinct hills covered with kunai grass and scattered trees. Deep ravines bordered both sides, heavily wooded and in some places nearly impenetrable. It was perfect terrain for a night attack by infiltrating infantry. It was also, if properly defended, a killing ground. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi's forces began their assault. Unlike Ichiki's frontal charge, this was a more sophisticated attack. Japanese infantry infiltrated through the ravines on both sides of the ridge, attempting to envelop American positions. Small units probed for weak points. When they found them, larger forces concentrated for breakthrough attempts. The fighting was savage and confused. In the darkness, Marines sometimes found themselves engaged in hand-to-hand combat with Japanese soldiers who had infiltrated to within grenade range. But the defensive preparations held. When Japanese forces concentrated for breakthrough attempts, Marine mortars and artillery shattered them. The 11th Marines fired more than 2,000 rounds during the night, dropping high explosive shells so close to Marine positions that shrapnel wounded friendly troops. Machine gun crews fired until their barrels glowed red in the darkness. Individual Marines fought with rifles, pistols, knives, entrenching tools, anything that came to hand. Sergeant Major Jacob Vusa, the same scout who had warned of the Tanaru attack, moved through the lines encouraging Marines and pointing out Japanese infiltrators. Sergeant John Basilone manned a machine gun position that became critical to the defense. When his gun crews were killed or wounded, Basilone continued firing alone, repelling wave after wave of Japanese attacks. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that night. As dawn broke on September 13th, the Japanese attack had failed to break through. But Kawaguchi had more troops available and prepared to renew the assault the following night. Edson pulled his lines back to the center of the ridge, consolidating his forces. Vandegrift sent reinforcements, bringing the total defending force to approximately 2,500 men. The Japanese would attack again, but this time the Marines were ready with even stronger positions and more concentrated firepower. The second night's fighting was even more intense than the first. Kawaguchi threw his remaining forces into desperate attempts to break through before American reinforcements made the position impregnable. Japanese soldiers charged repeatedly, dying by the hundreds in machine gun fire. Some attacks came within 50 yards of Edson's command post before being stopped. At one point, the situation was so desperate that Edson himself grabbed a rifle and joined the firing line. But again, American firepower and defensive preparation prevailed. By dawn on September 14th, Kawaguchi's offensive had completely collapsed. Japanese casualties were staggering, approximately 830 to 850 soldiers dead on and around what would forever be known as Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge. Marine casualties totaled approximately 104 killed and over 200 wounded between the raider and parachute battalions. For Japanese soldiers who survived, the battle represented another profound shock to their understanding of warfare. Captured diaries and accounts after the war consistently described the same realization. Japanese forces had expected to fight other infantry in darkness where their training and spirit would triumph. Instead, they encountered artillery, machine guns, and mortars, all concentrated with a precision they couldn't match. American commanders knew the Japanese were coming. They prepared killing zones. They waited for Japanese forces to enter. Then they destroyed them with coordinated fire support. The battles at Tenaru and Bloody Ridge established patterns that would repeat throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. Japanese forces would launch attacks based on courage, night tactics, and close combat expertise. American forces would respond with overwhelming firepower, coordinated combined arms, and defensive positions carefully prepared to maximize their advantages. The outcome was predictable. Japanese casualties would be catastrophic. American casualties would be significant but sustainable. But numbers alone don't capture the horror of jungle warfare on Guadalcanal. The environment itself became a weapon that killed with impartiality. Malaria infected nearly every man who spent more than a few weeks on the island. By December 1942, the 1st Marine Division would report over 8,000 malaria cases. Tropical diseases disabled approximately 2/3 of the division. Dysentery was universal. Men suffered from fungal infections that ate through skin. Jungle rot caused open sores that never healed in the humid heat. Dental problems with no treatment led to abscessed teeth and systemic infections. The Japanese suffered even worse. Their supply situation meant inadequate food from the beginning. Soldiers were supposed to receive field rations, but the Tokyo Express could rarely deliver enough. Men subsisted on whatever they could forage, supplemented by occasional rice deliveries that had to be stretched impossibly thin. Starvation became a constant companion. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Quinine for malaria prevention ran out quickly and was never adequately resupplied. Wounded soldiers often died from infections that would have been easily treatable with proper medicine. Japanese documents captured later in the campaign painted a horrifying picture of conditions. A medical officer's report from late October noted that more than 60% of the 17th Army's forces on Guadalcanal were incapacitated by disease or malnutrition. Combat effectiveness had dropped to perhaps 30% of authorized strength. Soldiers were dying at a rate of 50 per day, most from starvation and disease rather than combat wounds. American supply ships, protected by Henderson Field aircraft during daylight hours, regularly delivered food, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. Shortages occurred, particularly in August and early September, when naval defeats left the Marines temporarily cut off, but these were temporary. By October, the flow of supplies had become reliable. Marines ate canned rations that, while not appetizing, provided adequate calories and nutrition. Ammunition was plentiful enough that machine gunners could fire until their barrels wore out, then request replacements. Medical care included field hospitals with surgical capabilities, plasma for blood transfusions, sulfur drugs for infection, and eventual evacuation of serious cases to rear area hospitals. Japanese logistics consisted of whatever could be carried on destroyer decks or infiltrated through American lines. Soldiers learned to make a single rice ball last an entire day. Ammunition was conserved to the point that orders often restricted fire to only when absolutely necessary. Medical care meant a bandage if you were lucky, amputation without anesthesia if you were unlucky, or death if your wound became infected. Seriously wounded soldiers were often given grenades and left behind to commit suicide rather than burden their units or risk capture. In late October, the Japanese mounted their largest offensive of the campaign. General Hyakutake himself came to Guadalcanal to personally command the operation. He brought elements of the 2nd Division, including experienced troops from China. The plan called for coordinated attacks from multiple directions, with the main effort coming from the south through dense jungle similar to the Bloody Ridge approach. This time, however, Japanese forces would have more men, better coordination and artillery support that had finally been delivered via destroyers. The offensive began on October 23rd with a preliminary attack from the west. 9 Japanese tanks, rare on Guadalcanal because of the difficulty transporting them, led an assault across the Matanikau River. American defenders, including elements of the newly arrived 164th Infantry Regiment from the Americal Division, were ready. Anti-tank guns, artillery, and even a Stuart tank knocked out all 9 Japanese tanks in quick succession. The attack collapsed with heavy casualties. The main assault came on the night of October 24th to 25th. Approximately 5,600 Japanese troops under Major General Yumio Nasu attacked from the south, hoping to break through American lines south of Henderson Field. They faced 1st Battalion, 7th Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, reinforced by elements of the 164th Infantry Regiment. The fighting that night became legendary in Marine Corps history. Japanese attacks came in waves throughout the night. Individual breakthroughs were sealed by immediate counterattacks. Machine gunners fired until their weapons failed, then grabbed rifles and continued fighting. Artillery from the 11th Marines fired danger-close missions that landed within yards of Marine positions. Offshore, the battleship Washington stood by, ready to provide naval gunfire support if called upon. At one critical moment, only a single Marine battalion stood between Japanese forces and Henderson Field. But they held. The Japanese offensive had failed. General Nasu was dead, killed by machine gun fire during one of the night attacks. More than 2,000 Japanese soldiers died in the attempt to break through. American casualties were several hundred killed and wounded, severe but sustainable. October and November 1942 also saw major naval engagements that decisively shifted the balance of power around Guadalcanal. The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, fought over 4 days from November 12th through 15th, saw some of the most intense surface combat in naval history. In a confused nighttime melee on November 13th, American cruisers and destroyers engaged a Japanese bombardment force that included the battleships Hiei and Kirishima. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott died in the fighting, the only 2 American flag officers killed in Second World War surface engagements. The Americans lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, with 3 more destroyers damaged. But the Japanese lost the battleship Hiei, disabled in the night action and sunk by aircraft the following day. More importantly, the bombardment mission failed. Henderson Field remained operational. On the night of November 14th to 15th, the battleship Kirishima attempted another bombardment but was intercepted by the Washington and South Dakota. In a devastating display of American radar-directed gunnery, Washington put 9 16-inch shells into Kirishima at ranges where Japanese lookouts could barely see their target. Kirishima sank with heavy loss of life. Perhaps most significantly, American aircraft and surface ships destroyed a Japanese convoy attempting to land the 38th Division with heavy equipment. Of 11 transport ships, only 4 reached Guadalcanal, and these were destroyed by aircraft and artillery before they could fully unload. Japanese casualties from the convoy exceeded 5,000 men. This was the last serious attempt to reinforce Guadalcanal with a large, properly equipped ground force. For Japanese troops already on the island, November marked the beginning of the end. They had expected reinforcement and resupply. Instead, they learned that the naval battles had failed, that the convoys were destroyed, that no more help was coming. Rations were reduced again. Already starving men were told to survive on even less. Medical supplies that had been critically short became non-existent. The sick and wounded filled makeshift field hospitals where doctors could do nothing except watch men die. Captured Japanese diaries from this period painted a picture of slow collapse. Entries described rice rations reduced to 1 ball per day, disease spreading everywhere, bodies burned when soldiers had the strength, the realization that no more supplies were coming, men eating grass and bark, deaths from poisonous plants, the deterioration of soldiers into desperate starving shadows. December brought the final reckoning. Japanese command at Rabaul made the decision to evacuate Guadalcanal. They couldn't admit defeat publicly, but privately they recognized that continuing the operation meant the complete destruction of the 17th Army. Approximately 11,000 Japanese soldiers remained on the island, down from a peak strength of 36,000. Of those 11,000, perhaps 7,000 were fit enough to walk. The rest were sick, wounded, or so weakened by starvation they could barely crawl. The evacuation, designated Operation K, would be one of the most successful Japanese operations of the entire war. Using destroyer runs similar to the Tokyo Express, Japanese naval forces extracted 10,652 men over 3 nights in early February 1943. It was a remarkable achievement under difficult circumstances, but it couldn't disguise the magnitude of the defeat. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal reached a peak strength of approximately 36,000 personnel. Of these, roughly 25,000 to 30,000 died, about 14,800 killed in combat, and 10,000 to 15,000 died in combat from disease and starvation. American casualties were also severe but sustainable. The Marines and Army units that fought on Guadalcanal lost approximately 1,600 killed in action, 4,200 wounded, and several thousand more temporarily disabled by tropical diseases. But American industry and manpower could replace these losses. New divisions were already training. Ships and aircraft were being produced faster than they could be lost. The strategic initiative had permanently shifted. The psychological impact of Guadalcanal on Japanese military thought cannot be overstated. For the first time, Japanese forces had been defeated in sustained ground combat. Every offensive had failed. Every attempt to apply traditional Japanese tactics had resulted in catastrophic casualties. The realization that American forces were not only materially superior, but also tactically competent, well-led, and capable of enduring terrible conditions, shattered pre-war assumptions. Japanese officers who survived Guadalcanal and later wrote memoirs or were interviewed after the war consistently emphasized several themes. First, they had completely underestimated American fighting qualities. Second, the disparity in equipment and supplies was far greater than intelligence had suggested. Third, Japanese logistics were fundamentally inadequate for sustained operations against an enemy that controlled the sea and air. Fourth, spiritual power and tactical skill were insufficient against systematic disadvantages in firepower and resources. Accounts from Japanese veterans revealed a consistent assessment. They had believed they were superior warriors. They trained harder, accepted death more readily, mastered night fighting and close combat. But on Guadalcanal, they learned that war is decided by systems. The Americans had systems for everything: supply, medical care, artillery support, air coordination. Every system functioned. Japanese systems failed because they were never built properly in the first place. Japanese veterans who survived the campaign and were later interviewed provided detailed accounts that contradicted official explanations for defeat. They acknowledged that American forces fought superbly at night when defending prepared positions. They admitted Americans endured malaria, dysentery, and terrible conditions while maintaining combat effectiveness because logistics supported them. They recognized that American firepower was overwhelming, coordinated, and precisely delivered. A single American battalion had more effective firepower than an entire Japanese regiment. The technical aspects of American superiority were significant. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal fought with Arisaka rifles, bolt-action weapons requiring manual cycling between shots. American Marines initially carried Springfield rifles, also bolt-action, but supplemented by the M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle as these became available. The Garand's 8-round capacity and semi-automatic operation provided advantages in firefights. Machine guns told an even starker story. The American Browning was water-cooled and could sustain fire indefinitely as long as water and ammunition were available. Japanese machine guns, primarily the Type 96 and Type 99, were lighter and more portable but lacked sustained fire capability. In defensive positions, this difference was decisive. Artillery superiority was perhaps most significant. The 11th Marines operated pack howitzers that could be broken down and transported through jungle terrain. These 75mm weapons provided responsive, accurate fire support. Forward observers with infantry units could call for fire missions and receive rounds within minutes. Japanese artillery on Guadalcanal was limited, difficult to move through jungle, and chronically short of ammunition. Naval gunfire added another dimension that Japanese forces couldn't match. Destroyers and cruisers offshore could deliver bombardments on Japanese positions or provide responsive fire support for Marine ground units. Radio communication between shore-based observers and naval ships allowed precise targeting. Air power became increasingly dominant as the campaign progressed. The Cactus Air Force, operating from Henderson Field under terrible conditions, gradually established air superiority over Guadalcanal. Marine and Army Air Force pilots flying Wildcats, Airacobras, and Warhawks intercepted Japanese bomber raids. Dauntless dive bombers struck Japanese positions, supply ships, and troop concentrations. Japanese air forces from Rabaul had to fly at the extreme limits of their range, giving them minimal time over target. The final American ground offensive in January 1943 demonstrated how completely the balance had shifted. Major General Alexander Patch's 14th Corps, now including both Marine and Army divisions, launched coordinated attacks that systematically reduced remaining Japanese positions. The offensive had overwhelming support from artillery, air power, and naval gunfire. Japanese resistance, while determined, was hampered by starvation, disease, and ammunition shortages. On February 9, 1943, American patrols discovered that Japanese forces had evacuated. General Patch sent his famous message to Admiral Halsey. Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. The campaign was over. 6 months of fighting had resulted in the first major American ground victory against Japan. More importantly, it established patterns and revealed truths that would shape the rest of the Pacific War. The lessons Japanese survivors took from Guadalcanal were devastating to pre-war military doctrine. The myth of Japanese warrior superiority had been shattered. Individual courage and tactical skill were inadequate against systematic disadvantages. Night attacks and close combat, the hallmarks of Japanese tactical success in China, failed against American defensive positions. Supply and logistics were not secondary concerns, but fundamental requirements for sustained combat. Air and naval superiority determined outcomes on land. These lessons learned in blood and starvation on Guadalcanal should have fundamentally reformed Japanese military thinking. Some officers recognized the implications. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a staff officer who visited Guadalcanal during the campaign, wrote afterward that Japan needed to completely reassess its strategy. The Americans, he observed, were fighting an industrial war where material production determined outcomes. Japan couldn't win an industrial war against American productive capacity. But Japanese military culture, built on generations of tradition and recent victories, couldn't easily adapt. The official explanation for Guadalcanal blamed inadequate supplies, naval defeats, and the unexpected strength of American defenses. It didn't acknowledge that Japanese tactical doctrine itself was flawed, that the entire conception of warfare that had served Japan well against China was obsolete against a modern industrial opponent. Those Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal and were later captured, or who survived the war, described a profound psychological transformation. They had entered the campaign as confident warriors of an invincible empire. They left as starving, disease-ridden survivors of a catastrophic defeat. Many later described Guadalcanal as the moment they first understood that Japan would lose the war. Testimonies from Japanese veterans captured this transformation. They acknowledged learning truths that leaders had hidden. The Americans were not weak but overwhelmingly strong, not just in weapons but in organization, logistics, leadership, and the ability to sustain combat operations. Japanese forces fought with courage and skill. It didn't matter. American forces fought with systems and resources Japanese forces couldn't match. The American perspective on Guadalcanal emphasized different lessons. For Marines and soldiers who fought there, the campaign proved that American forces could match Japanese troops in the brutality of jungle combat. The mythology of Japanese invincibility was destroyed. American defensive doctrine worked. Combined arms coordination was effective. Individual American soldiers, properly trained and equipped, were more than capable of defeating Japanese forces. But Americans also learned respect for Japanese soldiers as tough, determined, skilled adversaries who would fight to the death rather than surrender. The willingness of Japanese forces to continue attacking in the face of hopeless odds, to endure starvation rather than give up, to die rather than retreat, made a profound impression. The contrast between the two sides' approaches to prisoner welfare and surrender illustrated fundamental cultural differences. American forces made efforts to encourage Japanese surrender, dropping leaflets, broadcasting radio messages, offering medical care and food to prisoners. These efforts had minimal success. Of approximately 36,000 Japanese troops who served on Guadalcanal, fewer than 1,000 were captured alive, and most of those were too sick or wounded to resist. The strategic implications of Guadalcanal extended far beyond the island itself. Japan's failure to retake Henderson Field and the eventual evacuation demonstrated that the Japanese defensive perimeter could be penetrated. Allied strategy shifted from defensive operations to offensive campaigns. The industrial and material advantages that America possessed could be translated into military victory if applied systematically. For Japan, Guadalcanal marked the beginning of the end. The loss of experienced troops, pilots, and ships couldn't be replaced at anything approaching the rate America was producing new forces. The decision to evacuate admitted, however quietly, that Japan couldn't sustain attritional warfare against American industrial might. The veterans of Guadalcanal on both sides carried their experiences for the rest of their lives. American Marines and soldiers who survived the campaign became cadres for new units, passing along hard-won lessons about jungle warfare, defensive tactics, and combined arms coordination. The 1st Marine Division pulled off Guadalcanal in December 1942, required months of rest and rehabilitation before returning to combat. Japanese survivors faced an even grimmer future. Those evacuated during Operation K were dispersed to other units throughout the Pacific, carrying with them the psychological burden of defeat and the knowledge that American forces were far more formidable than pre-war propaganda had suggested. Many would die in subsequent battles as Japan's strategic position continued to deteriorate. The island of Guadalcanal itself bore the scars of 6 months of intense combat for decades afterward. Wrecked aircraft, destroyed vehicles, abandoned equipment, and unexploded ordnance littered the jungles and coastal areas. Henderson Field expanded and improved during and after the campaign served as a major Allied base for subsequent operations in the Solomons. For military historians and strategists, Guadalcanal provided case studies in amphibious operations, jungle warfare, logistics, air-ground coordination, and the integration of naval power with land operations. The campaign demonstrated that modern warfare required more than brave soldiers and tactical skill. It required industrial capacity, effective logistics, technological superiority, and the ability to sustain operations over extended periods. The human cost of Guadalcanal was staggering on both sides. More than 7,000 American and Japanese servicemen died in the naval battles around the island. On land, American casualties exceeded 7,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Japanese losses exceeded 30,000 from all causes. Thousands more on both sides suffered from diseases and conditions that would affect their health for the rest of their lives. But the strategic significance justified in military terms the terrible cost. Guadalcanal represented the turning point where Allied forces shifted from defense to offense in the Pacific. It demonstrated that Japan could be defeated in ground combat. It established air and naval superiority patterns that would characterize the rest of the war. The story of Japanese troops encountering American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal is ultimately about the collision between two fundamentally different approaches to modern warfare. One side believed in the supremacy of warrior spirit, in courage overcoming material disadvantages, in tactics producing victory regardless of resources. The other side believed in systematic application of industrial power, in logistics and firepower as force multipliers, in combined arms coordination as the key to success. The jungle of Guadalcanal became the crucible where these conflicting philosophies met. The outcome, though it took 6 months of brutal fighting to reach its inevitable conclusion, demonstrated that concentrated fire support and logistics, when combined with competent tactics and determined soldiers, created a form of military power that Japanese forces simply couldn't match. For the Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal and lived to tell their stories, the campaign represented the moment when reality destroyed illusion. They learned that their training had been based on false assumptions, their tactics had been designed for a different kind of war, their logistics had been inadequate from the beginning, and their nation was engaged in a conflict it couldn't win through military means alone. The Americans who fought on Guadalcanal learned different but equally important lessons. They discovered they could match Japanese soldiers in the brutality of jungle combat. They proved that American industrial power could be translated into military victory. They developed tactics and doctrine for jungle warfare that would serve them well in subsequent campaigns. And they shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility, replacing it with a realistic assessment of a tough, determined, but ultimately defeatable enemy. Guadalcanal was where Japanese troops were terrified not by American soldiers as individual fighters, though they proved formidable, but by the systematic, overwhelming, relentless application of firepower and material resources that American forces brought to every engagement. It was a terror born not from fear of death, which Japanese soldiers had been trained to accept, but from the realization that courage and sacrifice were meaningless against an enemy whose supplies never ran out, whose wounded received care, whose artillery never stopped firing, whose aircraft controlled the skies, and whose industrial base could replace losses faster than combat could inflict them. The transformation that began when Japanese forces first encountered American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal marked a fundamental shift in the Pacific War. From that point forward, Japanese forces would be on the defensive, fighting a losing battle against an enemy whose material advantages grew larger with each passing month. The jungle warfare of Guadalcanal became the template for future campaigns, proving that American forces could fight and win in the most difficult terrain against a determined enemy, provided they had adequate logistics, effective coordination, and overwhelming firepower.